Moe's News Network presents Race, Gender, and Media Representation. Good evening and welcome to tonight's broadcast. I'm your host, Sean Metzler, and this evening, with the help of our commentators, Josh, Alexa, and Mikey, we're going to discuss the issue of media representation of gender and race in one of the most popular television shows of our time, The Office. First, let's talk to Josh about gender in the media and general media stereotypes of men and women. Josh?
Thank you for having me on the show, Sean. So a large part of gender stereotypes and what we see in media content has to do with our society's understanding of ideal masculinity and ideal femininity.
Are these ideals based off of what we as a society have as expectations of men and women? Are these just the beliefs?
Yes, in the majority of popular TV and films, male characters fall into a few common stereotypes, like being violent, egotistical, being dim-witted, or being the breadwinner of their family. The media portrays women as inferior and weak, or only successful because of their looks. Male characters tend to treat them as if they were objects, using stereotypes that lead the viewer to think less of women. However, what is unique about representations in The Office is that it presents audiences with stereotypes in more indirect ways, and in a way that it almost pokes fun at the stupidity of stereotypes through the main character, Michael Scott.
You know, Josh, I'm loving this. Can you give me an example of how this kind of portrayal happens?
Sure thing. In an episode of The Office, one of the characters, Meredith, is roasted by her boss, Michael Scott. He tells Meredith, "You've slept with so many men that you were starting to look like one."
Meredith, you've slept with so many guys, you're starting to look like one. Boom, roasted.
In this example, Meredith is not only slut-shamed by Michael, but she is criticized for her looks. We see how degrading Michael is towards women in this scene, which comes from his understanding of ideal femininity.
Wow, that's some extremely interesting stuff, Josh. Thank you, and now let's go on to our second commentator, Alexa. Alexa, can you tell me how stereotypes of gender seen on The Office are harmful or limiting to both men and women?
Thanks for having me on the show tonight, Sean. The example Josh spoke about from The Office offers stereotypes that are harmful and limiting to both men and women by reinforcing false beliefs and expectations that consumers are affected by, whether they realize it or not. While the show uses its humor to indirectly show us what is problematic about stereotypes, I think Michael definitely comes off as the stereotype of the brainless boss. He's disrespectful towards his female employees, and during this roast scene, it isn't surprising what he gets away with saying.
And well, what about Meredith? What is so harmful about how the way Michael stereotypes her in this show, and especially in this scene?
Well, I don't think Meredith is portrayed as a character women can relate to in general because she's the unattractive woman in The Office that no one respects. She's an alcoholic and very promiscuous and doesn't seem to have any real value. But when Michael mocks her, it almost seems like she agrees with what he says. There's nothing positive about her as a character, so when she's told she sleeps around too much and looks like a man and just accepts it, what kind of message does that send to audiences? It's very problematic.
Well, I want to thank you, Alexa, for your input on this tonight, and now I'd like to discuss the way that The Office deals with representation of ethnic and racial minorities. I think there's one episode in particular that comes to mind when examining racial stereotypes in the show, and that's the Diversity Day episode. Our third commentator, Mikey, is going to elaborate further on that. Mikey, let's hear it.
Good evening, Sean. The Diversity Day episode of The Office features a few stereotypical representations of ethnic minorities that are particularly harmful to the viewers. Most of the time, when including minorities into television or movies, producers need to rely on stereotypes to send out indirect messages. However, this episode of The Office directly introduces stereotypes to the viewers.
So what you're saying is that in this very episode, Mikey, it's pretty straightforward in the way that, well, it introduces the stereotypes to the audience, correct?
Exactly. In this episode, the employees of the Dunder Mifflin play a game in which cards are placed on each other's heads, and they have to figure out what race they are based on a series of hints. But these hints are really just offensive generalizations made about each minority group. For example, Dwight is told that he would be considered a bad driver. The card on his head reads Asian.
If I have to do this, based on stereotypes that are totally untrue, that I do not agree with, you would maybe not be a very good driver.
Oh man, am I a woman?
While this is a crude joke meant to be humorous, it reinforces the stereotype that Asians are bad drivers.
So for our viewers who are unfamiliar with the typecast of Asians as bad drivers, this scene has just introduced a negative stereotype towards them.
Yes. So the tie-in here is that the audience needs to interpret these jokes not as remarks that are funny because they're extremely offensive. Instead, when looking at characters like Michael Scott, we need to find the punchline within his ignorance. Michael and one of the other characters, Dwight, are so socially inept that they do not realize how distorted their worldviews really are.
So Mikey, what you're saying is that the show actually completely alienates the ideas of racism, making it the butt of the joke, rather than the minorities themselves?
Absolutely. So while this episode almost reinforces racial stereotypes, it also challenges them by highlighting how the other characters, the intelligent characters, are entirely against Michael and Dwight for their ridiculous ideas.
Mikey, I just want to take this moment to thank you so much for being on the show tonight. And that's all we have for now. Thank you to our commentators for speaking with us, and thank you to our viewers for tuning into this week's broadcast about gender, race, and representation in the hit TV show, The Office. We'll see you next time, and good night.